We last Sunday introduced the subject of fossil men. We pointed out that this is historical evidence, not strictly scientific proof that's provided by direct observation and experimentation. That one of the problems is that often you don't get to hear the whole picture. You just see part of the evidence. Major portions of it are left out and selected so that false impressions are given. There's a lot of playing around with the dating that we talked about and documented last Sunday. Excuse me, the lineup that we see illustrated here is not the way you find it in the fossil record. You dig them up, they don't have names on them, they don't have lines leading to one another. As Dr. Lumenton says, it's up to you to draw the lines because there are no lines, but they certainly do. And based on selective similarities, similarities can be deceptive, as we pointed out, but based on that, we get this kind of a lineup that looks like a progression. We want to examine that and consider the actual evidence that's involved, beginning with Australopithecus, the ape man down at the bottom. This is perhaps the most famous Australopithecus, that is Lucy, discovered by Donald Johanson a number of years ago. And we hear all about Lucy and the fact that she is half ape, half man, and a perfect example of the evidence that demonstrates from the fossil record that the apes led to man. Not everyone agrees with this conclusion. That is, not all of the secular paleoanthropologists. Lord Solly Zuckerman is one of the leading authorities in the field, and he has plainly disagreed. He says the dismissal of the Australopithecines as having anything to do with evolution. They're just bloody apes. This is quoted in Bones of Contention by Roger Lewin, editor of Research News. He's perhaps the most famous paleoanthropologist in Europe. And he says the Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian as opposed to human that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white. Now that's a very flat-footed, dogmatic statement. This is absolutely not human. It is an ape, doesn't lead to humans. Why would he make such a dogmatic assertion in the face of the fact that a good many people in the United States have accepted the evidence? Figure 5 he refers to in that text shows one of the reasons why. We see the chimpanzee skulls on the left, we see the Australopithecine skulls on the right, and they could be twins. I mean, that's very, very similar. Now, the dentition is somewhat different with the Australopithecines, but we do find Galata baboons with dentition just like this. Apes have teeth like this, some of them do, but that looks very simian, very ape-like, not human-like, and he says it is overwhelmingly simian, and he does so with very good reason. And so he says this is just black and white, no question about it. It's also interesting to notice the footprints that were found by Mary Leakey, supposedly at the same time in Africa, and asserted that these are Australopithecine footprints in the Latoy footprints there in Africa. Notice her comment, as quoted in Time magazine. They belonged to the genus Homo, or true man, rather than man-apes like Australopithecus. No, they weren't Australopithecine. They were at the time of Australopithecine, but they were like true men. They would be 3.35 million to 3.75 million years old. And we talked about the dating procedures last time. But they would, in Mary Leakey's words, be people not unlike ourselves. So back at the time when we have Australopithecine, we have people, footprints that do not fit the ape mold. We have more evidence since they were found, reported here in Science Daily, that in a very technical way analyzed these footprints. He says they fall completely within the range of normal human footprints. Now, we look at the human footprint compared with the ape footprint, and on the right we see now we have, not originally, that is, Lucy didn't have feet, that is the original skeleton, but now then we have found more examples, and the later examples included a foot, and it's an ape foot. Now, the Latoi footprints at the same time were fully human, whereas Lucy's footprints are ape-like. The opposing foot, thumb, big toe shows that this is very different from the human. It has a divergent big toe, indicates the prehensile grasping. The ape has the hand for the foot, and not like the Latoi footprints at all. This is as in the ape. So there are ape footprints, that is, ape feet with human footprints at the same time. Well, that would tend to indicate not one leading to the other, but both of them together, which a creationist would not be surprised by at all. But there are a number of problems with the skeleton of Lucy as it's proposed as the ancestor of man. The main feature that we're told that convinces people that it's in the lineage that leads to man is the fact that it stood upright. Well, it stands upright with a lot of help. I'd like to introduce you to David Minton, and we're going to do a clip from him in a presentation that he made not too long ago as he describes the anatomy of the hips that supposedly made Lucy walk upright. Now, Dr. Minton was 30 years professor of anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis, one of the more famous anatomists in the country. If you pick up a medical textbook, you're going to find a number of articles by him. Now, he is a devout creationist, unlike most of those authorities that we quote. But let's notice what he has to say about the ape orientation of the hips.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Latoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it, you'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, And current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bone seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So,
It's interesting that at least 12 specimens have been found since the original hip surgery, and all 12 of them needed hip surgery. That is, they all were chimp hips, not human. But the whole point is to show that she walked upright. And what's the point? Why does that prove that this is in the ancestry that leads to man? There was an interesting article recently, actually from Israel. A macaque monkey, along with several in the family of macaque monkeys, came down with the flu, and some of them died. One of them recovered. And the workers at the zoo say that that's when she started walking upright exclusively. Now, normally they're on all fours and then sometimes semi-upright, but this one walked upright exclusively after she recovered. A zoo veterinarian says she's not sure why she's altered her behavior, that the illness could have caused brain damage. So maybe that's why we walk upright, brain damage. The point is, if they walked upright, that means they lead to humans. I'm not sure that follows. We look at a lot of animals that walk upright, chickens that walk upright and keep tune. You've got prairie dogs and anteaters and lizards, and some lizards walk upright well enough to run across the water, and some of them are upright well enough to sell insurance. I'm not sure that proves anything about the lineage that leads to man. Dr. Zillman talks about Lucy and the similarity to the pygmy chimp. And she says the pygmy chimp is very similar to Lucy, one of the oldest hominid fossils known, finds the similarities striking, almost identical in body size and stature and brain size. These commonalities, Zillman argues, indicate that the pygmy chimps use their limbs in much the same way Lucy did. So we find the pygmy chimp walking like Lucy did. And teeth, as we indicated, just like the Galata baboon. William Howells notices other similarities with apes when he's talking about the Lucy type. The pelvis was by no means modern, nor were the feet. Now, William Howells is head of the anthropology department at Harvard in his book, Getting There. Toes were more curved than ours for wrapping around the branches. The heel bones lacked our stabilizing tubercles. A couple of small ligaments that in us tighten the arch from underneath were apparently not present. Finger bones were curved, as in tree-climbing apes. And what does that sound like to you? As we look at the leading paleoanthropologist in the country, and this is pretty much the Hall of Fame, paleoanthropologists today, David Peelbeam of Yale, Isaac of Harvard, Cartmill of Duke. They said in American Scientist a number of years ago, the Australopithecines are rapidly shrinking back to the status of peculiarly specialized apes. That doesn't bode well for those who try to say this is the star of the show that leads to man. As we summarize the evidence, she walked like an ape, had a brain the size of an ape, had teeth like the Galata baboon, a face like an ape, arms like an ape, and hands like an ape, feet like an ape, and toes like an ape. Now, what does that sound like to you? I don't think that was a duck. I think this was an ape, and they stick it in the lineage that leads to man because they have assumed that this is true, that the apes led to man. You've got to have an example somewhere, and so they stick it in there. They don't have anything better. I don't think it's a very good example. The next in the rung of the ladder, is Homo erectus. Historically, this is where the story begins. As you go back to Darwin, he said there would be an ape more human-like or a human more ape-like found in the fossil record, predicted that he would. Eugene Dubois decided that the people in Java were most primitive people he knew about, and so he went to Java, quit his job, and went to Java to hunt for what Darwin said would be the fossil man, and came up with Java man. Now, the racial implications of that kind of thinking are revolting, but that was the thinking, and that's exactly what he expressed in his writing. He found these bones in Java and decided that these were examples of the primitive man. He put them together. Now, they weren't found in the same place, up to 75 yards apart. A very human-like leg bone, an ape-like skull, I think turned out to be a giant gibbon. But this was Java man and was illustrated in the textbooks for years. Somewhat fell out of favor in recent years because of dating problems. Wilprof of University of Wisconsin has said actually it wasn't but about 27,000 years ago, not the 500,000 years ago that was originally claimed. But he says they are actually examples of Homo erectus. They belong to an anatomically diverse form of Homo sapien. They're just different. You look at Chinese and Eskimos and people in Australia, you see diverse forms, but they're good people. But he dated it to 27,000, which really messes up the idea that this could lead to man. Well, more recently in science, last year, they have dated it again. They did acknowledge that they could not get the bones to date as they wanted them to. They said it's approximately 100,000 years according to the new analysis, fossils from the site in central Java. But he says the bones were notoriously difficult to date, so they instead dated the animal bones associated with it, and they got that to come out like they wanted to. Not the bones that were in question, but the animal bones associated, and they could get that to come out to 100,000 years. So 100,000 years ago, man looked like the Homo erectus that's restored to look like this very primitive feature. And in 100,000 years, that evolved to a man like Ben Carson today, one of the more famous neurosurgeons in the world. I don't think that happens. Even given all of the assumptions of the evolutionist in 100,000 years, when actually it's more like 27,000 years according to their assumptions. We look, for example, at the horseshoe crab that's supposed to be 425 million years ago, and they're swimming around in the ocean and look just like that. They haven't changed in 425 million. And here in 100,000, you go from Homo erectus to Ben Carson. Again, the racist implications are sickening. But this is good evidence? I don't think that's evidence at all. I think it's just playing games with the dating and trying to fit the ugly stepsister's foot into the glass slipper when it doesn't fit. Also, as a representative of Homo erectus, this second rung of the ladder that we're looking at, we see Piltdown Man. That turned out to be a fraud, but for 40 years it was in the textbooks. These were the men that examined them and concluded these were actually perfect examples of the ape man that Darwin had predicted. Notice the statement about the conclusion of these men by Roger Lewin, a devout evolutionist, in his book Bones of Contention. He says, how is it that trained men, the greatest experts of their day, could look at a set of modern human bones, the cranial fragments, and see a clear simian signature? Now, they were modern humans, but stained fraudulently, but they saw an ape and see in an ape's jaw the unmistakable signs of humanity. The ape's jaw, they see human. The ape cranium, they see human. This is what they see. The answers inevitably have to do with the scientist's expectations and the effects on the interpretation of the data. As someone says, if I hadn't have believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And that's what we see illustrated. Finally, it was recognized that it was a very crude fraud and removed after actually about 50 years in the textbooks. Also about this time, early 1900s, the Nebraska Man was proposed by Harry Fairfield Osborn, who was head of the American Museum of Natural History. And this was the link that led to man, called him Hesperopithecus harold-cooki, who Harold Cook was the one who actually made the discovery. It was based on a tooth. These are two views of the same tooth. And based on that tooth, this is what they came up with. Well, they continued to examine the area and found another one in the jaw that showed that this really wasn't a human tooth at all. It was an extinct peccary or pig. And so that has been removed, but he got into the textbooks, and in the monkey trial in Johnson City, Tennessee, this was one of the stars of the show. Someone said instead of calling him Hesperopithecus harold-cooki, they ought to call him Hesperopigdunfulum cuckoo. Not a very scientific critique, but then it's not a very scientific form of evidence. One of the representatives of Homo erectus today, very famous, and would be in the textbooks today, would be the 1470 skull that we referred to briefly earlier. This is New Kenya Museum, East Rudolph, 1470, discovered by Richard Leakey. His initial comments would make it very difficult to put this in the lineage that leads to man, though that's where it is in the textbooks. He says either we toss out this skull or we toss out our theories of early man. It's 2.8 million years old. That would be the right time for something that is supposed to lead to man. But he's tentatively identified this as belonging to our own genus. Now, if we've got humans 2.8 million years ago, then that's not boding well for those supposed links at that time that are supposed to lead to man. Man was already there. Further evidence is seen in the endocrinal casts that are like that of modern human, according to the article in Science. Dean Falk plainly says, I mean, the lobes, the shape of the brain, this is human. And so Leakey says it simply fits no previous models of human beginning. The skull's surprisingly large brain case leaves in ruins the notion that all the early fossils can be arranged in an orderly sequence of evolutionary change. We got men back there at the time when we're supposed to have the lynx. Another representative of Homo erectus would be the Turkana